welcome to the World Storytelling Cafe for those that have not joined us before. And this is our Monday night magazine program, Connecting the World by Stories. And I have enormous pleasure tonight to be introducing Amy Douglas, who's not only a fantastic storyteller, but is the keeper of the tradition. There's and amongst them, yeah, it's a big reason. How heavy does it weigh on your shoulders, Amy?
It's a bit scary now.
But amongst the things she's keeper of, she was apprenticed to Duncan Williamson, the great traveller storyteller, and she's been working on his archive, and she's going to tell you in a minute about a little bit about the project, because it's a really exciting project. And it's really appropriate that we're doing it tonight because again, you know, I mean, I have a special event coming up in a couple of weeks, but it's really great to have it in the middle of Gypsy Traveller and Roma History Month, which has kind of got, you know, with everything that's going on, got a bit submerged. So Amy, thank you for this amazing. We did plan it this way, didn't we? You know, it was nothing to do with coincidence. And
completely
planned. So Amy, you know, this is kind of like an interview where I shut up for about 3 hours, and then Amy shuts up for a minute, and then I rattle on, and Amy rattles on, and anyone else can chip in, I think. So Amy, do you want to tell us about this amazing project?
Yeah, so I was very, very lucky to study with Duncan Williamson, and I started going to see Duncan. The first time I went up, I was 18, and I was very lucky to be doing a storytelling apprenticeship, and Duncan was one person that I was going to see as a year being a storytelling apprentice, and of course I went to see him once, and that was never going to be enough, and he went, I think you could probably do with coming back, Amy. So I did, and I kept going back to see him, sadly, until he died, and I miss him dreadfully. But on one of those occasions that I went up, he opened the door to the cupboard underneath the stairs and started pulling out all of these cardboard boxes and said, Amy, these are a load of reel-to-reel recordings that somebody recorded of me. I haven't got any room for them, and if you don't take them, I'm going to put them in the skip. So of course I took them all and put them in my car and took them home. But I mean, I probably had more access to reel-to-reel players than most teenagers in the 1990s. That still wasn't a huge amount. So I did work at the local radio station, and I was at university in Leeds by that point. And I went into the Polytechnic and I said, can I borrow a studio over the summer holidays when there's not anybody around? And I started transferring some of those reel-to-reels onto mini discs at that point. But it all had to be done in real time. Which is great, you know, to spend a day just listening to Duncan talking and to listen to recordings of him, but there's still a limit to what you can do in a week of borrowed studio time. And I never really got very far with getting those tapes done, because at that point I would generally have a week off and a week when I could either go and see Duncan or sit in a studio listening to Duncan on tapes. So of course I would choose to go and see Duncan, and then he died and I couldn't bear to touch them for a little while, and then they started to look at me very meaningfully and glare at me every time I came into the shed. I mean, I had them in proper storage, but I was very aware that these tapes were from the 70s and the 80s, and if I didn't do something about them, then they were going to be completely unplayable. And I'd sort of kept trying to find ways of sorting out. And at last I applied to the Arts Council England to digitise the tapes, and for me to have some time with them, to actually listen to them. And I'm 44 now, and I was 18 when I started going to see Duncan. I'm a different person to the teenager who started going up to see him, and there's so many questions that I wish I'd asked, and if I was studying with him now, I would be asking different questions. I would be working on stories in a completely different way, and so I wanted to have some time to really think about that. And so I've been listening to the tapes and thinking about my apprenticeship and learning stories that I have known but not really told before, and just having some space to be in that place. And a lot of things have come out of that. And I mean, one of them is just the fact that when I first met Duncan, it was very much a personal connection. And I didn't think about the wider context of the stories at all. We met and we clicked, and I learned stories from him. He wanted to tell stories to me. I really desperately wanted to learn stories. And I was just learning stories from another human being. And of course, now I'm very much aware of the whole fact that he was a tradition bearer of Scottish traveller culture. And I am not a traveller, and I make absolutely no claim to be at all. So that's quite an interesting place to sit, to have all of these stories and this material. But it's not my tradition as well. So how do I share that, and how do I hold it, and how do I tell it? So that, in a nutshell, is my project, except that the other side of the Arts Council England is obviously they want to develop an individual person and an individual artist. So they were fine for me to digitise all of these tapes, but they're Scottish tapes, it's Scottish heritage. They were fine for me to develop it as a resource for me and for my development, and for me to get better at my digital skills. So I've been using all of these tapes for Duncan as a focus for me to hoik myself into the 21st century and actually learn how to use computers a little bit better, and learn how to podcast and to blog and to use social media, all of things that sort of filled me with fear this time a year ago, which did mean that when lockdown hit and all of this started, I wasn't ahead of everybody else, but I wasn't quite as far behind as I had been. Right. So how's that for a start? Does that work as an introduction?
I think that's a start, and kind of interesting when you were saying, you know, like you weren't from the traveller tradition, but and Duncan was. But of course, Duncan was one of the few, because he was an artist, he was a performer, and he'd spent his life. He didn't, you know, not whether it was his working life, so working as a cook on the hydroelectric dam, and I love that story, when they asked him to water down the soup, and he said, if you think I'm going to water down the soup for men that have been out in this, working out in sub-zero temperatures all day, you got the wrong cook. And he put on his coat and went out to his man and left. But you know, so but from that, and then performing, I mean, I think for a while he was with, you know, whether it was one day, because of course you never knew, you know, that time thing, but he was with he worked with the Humble Bums for a while, so he was always crossing over. And so I think he'd loved the fact, you know, he wanted everyone to tell his stories. He didn't care who they were, and that was part of Duncan. That was part of his charm, I think. But of course,
absolutely. And the other thing is, although he absolutely is a tradition bearer for Scottish travellers, and he was a Scottish traveller, he was an absolute magpie. So not all of the stories, the Scottish traveller stories, he fell in love with stories as soon as he started hearing them when he was a child. And he left his parents when he was 14 and went travelling with Sandy, his brother, and they would be, you know, doing the rounds and hawking, and he learned all kinds of jobs. So he would be working with stonewallers in bothies and with fishermen, and whenever there was a break, or they'd be sitting in the evening, you know, in the bothy or whatever, he would have a story to tell to kick people off. But although he could easily, I think, at any point of his night, kind of keep going for a whole evening, just hold everybody for an evening, he never ever would. He'd kick things off, and then he'd sit back and then he'd go, well, I bet you've got a story you could tell. Have you got a song? And he had a beautiful way of pulling stories and poems and songs out of people, and he had a phenomenal memory. So wherever he went, he'd be collecting stories, and so a huge amount of the stories, probably more stories of his, are from the settled community than from the traveller community.
Yeah, I mean, but he did have, you know, the ones that definitely fitted in to that tradition. You know, I mean,
yeah.
You know, he's not. You could ask him about, you know, give me a story about anything in the world, and he'd give you one. But you know, he loved, for instance, Selkie stories. you know, which is, you know, and I love them because, you know, being East Anglian, you know, we've got seals all around you know, we've got those huge colonies in Suffolk and Norfolk. So I think, you know, when he told them down our way, that would be, you know, they'd have a particular thing. Do you happen to have a silky story?
Oh, I love silky stories. I've got lots. Which one? I think I'll tell you this one. And I'm not going to look at the chat while I'm telling a story, but, you know, do feel free to stick things on the chat, and I want this to be sort of a discussion and open it up. So we've sort of rushed into this very much. I guess we haven't really told you exactly who Duncan was, because John and I both knew him, and does everybody else who's here actually know who Duncan was and have a bit of an idea? Everybody's making blank faces.
It'd be helpful to hear more, Amy. It would be helpful, a little bit of background for some of us.
So I'll give you a little bit about background, then I'll definitely tell you a silky story. So Duncan Williamson was born, I think it was 1929. So he was born in between the wars, and he was of the Scottish travelling people, and the Scottish travelling people have a similar lifestyle to gypsies, but they are a separate race. So Duncan always said that the Scottish traveller people, they're the indigenous people of Scotland. They were the people that were here first, and they travelled with the seasons, and they made a living from the land. And then other nations and races came and settled in Scotland and started claiming bits of land and building, while the travellers kept travelling. And he very much identified with other indigenous peoples. So that's what the Scottish travellers are. They have lots of nicknames. They've suffered lots of prejudice. So when people are talking about tinkers, they're talking about Scottish travellers usually. And the tinker name comes from a tinsmith. And Duncan's father was a tinsmith. And he grew up in Argyll. And his father fought in the First World War, as most of the travelling men did. And when he was in the First World War, he saved his commanding officer's life. And the officer said, after the war, you are welcome to stay on my land whenever and for as long as you like. And so that's what happened. After the war, Duncan's father came back and they settled in Argyll on the Laird's land, the Duke of Argyll. And every winter they would put up a big galley tent, the sort of big barricades, and they're pretty big tents, sort of made with poles and covered in canvas, and then most of that would be burnt at the end of the winter, and then they would go travelling when the yellow's on the broom. It's a classic thing, sort of probably about May time when the weather is good.
Wasn't there an interesting bit about literacy at that point? Well,
there's so many little stories.
Sorry, but I think it's kind of relevant to, you know, because it's in one hand it's kind of unusual, because Duncan's father was embarrassed at not being able to read his letters, and one of the reasons they settled on that land was because they kept, like every other traveller, that kept moving on. And he wanted his children to go to school. He wanted his father wanted his children to learn and to read and write. And they kind of settled in that one place because the Duke of Argyll, you know, was. Duncan, you say if so much as a carrot went missing, it was them tinkers in the woods. But he did stay at school till he was 13. So he had, you know, and. Let's see, my dad left school at 14, so you know, so it wasn't. So he pretty well had a full education for that time.
To be fair, most of the travellers did settle in one place for the winter time, and they did go to school at that time, because if they didn't have their attendance book marked, if they didn't have 200 attendances on their book, then the children could be taken away from the parents.
Yeah, 1914 Education Act, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So when the school inspector came round, who was known as the Cruelty Man, if you didn't have enough crosses on your book, the kids would be taken away. So they made sure, and it didn't matter how sick you were, you went to school to get your cross. And an attendance was a half a day, so they had to spend 100 days going to school, and so but they would always come back to that same school. And Duncan's father was very much determined. I mean, he would sit and he would make sure that they did know their letters. And it was about the First World War, because they would try and send love letters back between them, Duncan's daddy and his mum. And she had to go to the priest to have hers read. And then she would have to get the priest to write the letter to be sent to Duncan's father, who would then have it read by the Duke of Argyll. So there was no privacy. There was no really way of sending a love letter. And he was just determined that his children would not be in that position. But yeah, so but the children always wanted to go to school because they were desperate to go off traveling in the summertime. So I'm just having a little look. There's lots of things been coming up on the chat about this. Did you ever say why it was storytelling that took hold of him and not something else? He just fell in love with stories. I mean, it was a lot to do with his granny. His granny was the storyteller of their family. And hang on, I've got behind me. This is a very, very precious gift from Linda Williamson. And this was Betsy White's mother's pocket. But all traveller women would have a pocket like this, because it's much easier to make a pocket like that and have one pocket that you have all the time rather than to put them into clothes. And so instead of having as a handbag, it's sort of the female equivalent of a sporran, and you'd have that sort of, tied around your waist. And when they camped in the barricade over the winter time, and quite often actually Duncan's daddy ended up staying there for quite a bit of the summer, and then the kids would go off in different directions. But in the big barricade, they'd have a little section that was for mum and dad. They'd have a little section that was for the girls, a little section for the boys, and a little section for granny. But you can imagine, like, Duncan was one of 16 children. So everybody was pretty much on top of each other. And this was granny's little bit of privacy. And whenever they wanted a story, and Duncan and his little sister Jeannie, they particularly loved stories. There was a whole thing that she would give them a threepenny bit and send them down to the shop, and a penny would be to buy her tobacco, and then they'd have a penny each for sweets. But then also the payment would be to come back, bring the baccy, and then she would tell them a story. And so they'd come and they'd sit down and go, "Can I have a story now?" And she would look inside and she'd say, "Oh, I think I'll tell you that story today." And she'd tell them the story. Well, then one time, Duncan and Jeannie, they came back from the shop with the tobacco, and Granny was lying there and she'd fallen asleep. She was snoring away. And normally if she did that, if she'd taken her pocket off, she would have had it as a pillow, but she'd rolled over, so her pocket was left lying. Well, I don't think I would have been able to resist it either, and Duncan and Jeannie certainly couldn't resist it. So they picked up the pocket and they tiptoed away, and they went and they sort of looked inside, and there was bits of sheep wool, and there were mother of pearl buttons, and let's see what else was Granny's little clay pipe and Jew's harp and all sorts of little bits and pieces. No stories, not a single story in there. And so they put everything back exactly where they found it, obviously, tidied it all up, left it there, went off to play. Well, that night, everybody was gathered around the fire, and they had the cooking pot going over the fire. It wasn't quite ready. All the children were gathered, and Duncan said, "Oh, Granny, will you tell the Waynes a story?" And she said, "Oh, well, I owe Duncan and Jeannie a story anyway." And she got a pocket and she looked inside. And she said, "I'm sorry, I can't tell you a story tonight. Somebody has been in my pocket and they've let all the stories out." And Duncan said that from that point on, she wouldn't tell them another story. And that was it. So maybe that's partly why that Duncan particularly liked the stories. I mean, he'd already started telling stories at that point, and he said he used to tell stories to the other children at school, and there was only one teacher, so sometimes she'd be there with the older children and she'd leave Duncan to tell a story to the younger children. But there is a thing within Traveller Society that you don't step into somebody's shoes. Sorry? I thought somebody was asking something. You don't step into somebody's shoes while they're still around. So normally you wouldn't have a new storyteller coming up within a family until the old storyteller had died. But by doing that, by stopping telling the stories, Granny kind of sort of abdicated her role as being a storyteller, which meant that she was able to foster Duncan a little bit more as a storyteller. And so he would started telling the stories, because obviously all the stories out the pocket hadn't been lost, they'd gone into Duncan's head. But she was there with kind of a sharp elbow just to make sure that he got bits and pieces right as he started telling the stories, I think. So does that answer that question?
Yes,
thank you very much.
It sounds the why, and it's kind of, if we can come in and out on his later life as well, it would be. But should we have a story first, and then
a story? Yes.
Then maybe talk about, because there's this huge space between his childhood and when he starts performing.
There is. Yeah, certainly when he starts performing outside of the traveller tradition, but hopefully that gives a little bit of an idea of
a starting point. Yeah. So can we have a story, Amy?
Yeah. Well, Duncan always had a connection with seals, and right from the beginning, I mean, he was a very independent child, and there was one particular day when he had just had enough of school and he was really hungry and he wasn't able to concentrate, as his belly was rumbling, and it came to lunchtime and he just left. He ran away from school, and he begged a match off a fisherman, and he had his little can, and he went and he started gathering shellfish, and he gathered all sorts of little bits of shellfish, and then he lit himself a fire. And he started to cook the shellfish over the fire, and he'd gone quite a long way out by this time. He'd gone along the coast and he'd gone out onto a spit of land, and he hadn't really thought about how far he'd gone. And once he'd had something to eat, as we quite often do when you've had something to eat, he lay down, he had a little snooze, and when he woke up he realised that the tide was coming in, and the tide had already come in too far for him to be able to get back, and the little spit of land that he was on was going to be cut off, and it was going to be an island, and it was going to be pretty much 12 hours before he was able to get off that bit of land. So he was going to be there overnight. His parents were going to be really annoyed, but there wasn't much he could do about it. And he also knew that although they would be annoyed, it wasn't safe for him to try and swim back. The current was too strong, and they would much rather that he stayed put than try to get back. But as the tide came in, so did the seals, and the seals started pulling themselves up onto the rocks and onto the gravel, and they started sort of clumping together. And he had his fire and he was on one bit. They gave him a little bit of space, and he tried to see what other driftwood there was around. I mean, he'd already taken most of the fire, so he's going to struggle to keep the fire going over the night. But he huddled himself up and he tried to stay warm, and he said he didn't get a wink of sleep all night, because there was this one seal, a big bull seal, and it was and it was moaning and groaning the entire night, and he was just sat up going, "Will you shut up?" and just getting really annoyed with this seal just making a racket all night long. And he said it was years later, he was sort of just telling this as an anecdote to a fisherman, and he said, "Duncan, you need to have a bit more compassion. Do you know why that seal was moaning and groaning all night long?" And he said, "No, it just was doing my head in him, and he was just seemed to be doing to irritate me, to be honest." He said, no, it would have been in pain. And it's the fish that they catch, as they get older, it gets stuck in their back teeth, and it's their back teeth quite often they start to rot. And I bet you anything that old bull seal had really awful toothache, and that's why he was making such a racket all night. And you should have a bit more compassion for him. And just from his very early days, he always had that kind of link with seals. He was always seeing seals, being around seals, watching seals, and starting to hear stories about them. And so this is one of the ones that he collected, not from his family, but from when he was working around the West Coast. And Mary and Angus, they had a little croft, and it was far enough back from the shore to escape the worst of the gales and the floods and the tide, so that their house and their little bit of land would be safe. But it was close enough that Angus worked as a fisherman. And every day he would go off and he would take out his boats and he would set his nets and he would pull in the fish. And he'd get enough fish to feed them, well, as a family, as the two of them anyway. They'd always wanted a family, but it had always just been him and Angus, and now they were long past the times when having children was a possibility anymore. So there'd be enough fish to feed him and Mary, but there'd be enough fish sometimes, hopefully, to take them into the town and to sell them as well and to make a little bit of money on top. And Mary, she'd stay at home and she would tend the garden, and it's quite difficult to get much out of the land when there's that much salt. But she had managed to get a little bit of an orchard. She had an apple tree and a pear tree, and she coaxed them and looked after them. And so they had the fruit and potatoes and things out of the ground. But Angus, he hated the seals, loathed them with a passion. And every day Mary would hear him coming home, clomp, 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 and he'd be dragging the nets behind him, and he'd be swearing and cursing under his breath. And he'd be bringing the nets into the house before the fire, and he'd be saying, those dratted seals, bloody seals, they've been in the nets again, they've taken the fish, they've taken the heads off them, left them to rot, and they made holes in the nets. And he'd spend every evening retying and sorting out the holes in the nets and repairing them. Hated the seals. And Mary be sat there and she'd go, well, Angus, how would you feel if the seals came into our garden and started taking the apples off the tree? He says, well, they better not blooming think about it. It's bad enough they're taking their fish. He says, well, that's exactly what you're doing though, isn't it? You're going out into their world. You're going out into the sea. You're taking their food. If they take a few of their own fish out of your nets, well, you can't really blame them. Well, I think I can. And it was an argument that would rumble on and rumble on. It had all of their marriage, and it probably was going to carry on until one of them passed on, because it was just one of those things, always there, always a grumble. And Mary would leave him to it. And she'd be doing her own stitching. She'd be knitting socks while he was mending the nets. And the next day it'd be the same again. Out Angus would go fishing. Now, Mary, she would do whatever she could to help the two of them and to keep that little croft going. And one of the things that, it was a job, but it was also something that she loved to do, was to go down to the shore, particularly when there'd been a big storm. And when there was a big storm, the deep sea kelp, it would get pulled up by the storm and it'd be washed up onto the shore, and you could go and pick it up along the high tide mark. And she would have a big rubber apron, and she would walk along the coast, and she would take all the kelp and she'd pile it up, and she'd make a big stack of it and dry it out and have it on the coast ready. There'd be a man who'd come down from the south every couple of months or so, and he would buy the kelp, buy the seaweed that she'd got, and it would go into all sorts of things. She thought mostly it probably went into perfume, but it went into this and that and the other. And he was willing to pay a bit of money to her for it, and she was very happy to do a little bit of beach combing when there'd been a storm. And one particular day, there'd been a big storm, but it had cleared. The wind had shifted. And now there was a freshness and a brightness to the day. And she took the path that led down to the beach. And she had her rubber apron on. And she was walking along, her feet crunching in the shingle. And she saw that amongst all the seaweed, there was a seal pup. Just a little seal. I mean, it was old enough that it lost most of the white of its coat, and its coat was turning grey. But it was still small. And she gave it a wide berth, and she was looking out to the sea, looking to see if there were any heads bobbing above the water. There was nothing. And she didn't want to make it smell of humans if the mother might still be around. And so she carried on down the shoreline, picking up the kelp. And when she came back in the other direction, the seal was still there. And so she stacked up all the kelp, and she went over and she took that little seal and she rolled it up in a rubber apron. And she took it home. And when she got home, she could still, she could feel it still had the warmth in it, and it didn't appear to have any marks on it. And it must have just been taken by the storm, just taken and rolled in the surf until it was exhausted. And they had a little goat back at the croft, and she took some milk and she took a cloth and she dipped the cloth in so that it could suck from the cloth. And it sucked for a while, and then it fell asleep in her arms. And she took the logs out of the log basket and piled them up by the side of the fireplace, and she put a little old blanket in the basket, and she tucked it up in the basket like a puppy, wrapped it up in a blanket. And there she was, sat knitting, seal at her feet, when Angus came back home that night. And he came in dragging his nets as usual, cursing and complaining and mumbling and grumbling about those wretched seals. They've been in my nets again. They've been biting and tearing. Have you seen the amount of work that I've got to do? What is that? It's a seal pup, Angus. I can see it's a seal. What is it doing in my house? Well, I think you'll find that it's my house as well, Angus. I will not have a creature like that in my house. Here I am, sat, sorting out all the work that it's probably its parents that have trashed my nets, and you're welcoming it into the house, feeding it up so that it can go into the sea and it can start chewing on my nets tomorrow. Quite probably, said Mary. Well, Angus, he blustered and he complained and he argued and he shouted, and Mary sat there knitting. But at the end of the evening, the seal pup was still there in the basket. And it was still there the next morning. Well, it wasn't actually in the basket anymore. It managed to tip the basket over, and it was flipping along with its head up. And everywhere Mary went, that seal was at her heels. And she was talking to it. She'd opened up a little can of mackerel. Angus's catch the day hadn't been very good. And he came in and went, "It's not even the leftovers of the catch. You're feeding it a tin of fish." Well, it was hungry, she said. Well, Angus, he stomped out in a terrible mood, off to catch the tide, off to set his mended nets. Mary smiled down at the pup. And that pup, it followed her as she hung out the washing, and it followed her as she made the food, and it followed her as she made the bread. And she would talk to it all day long, and she'd sing to it, and she'd tell it stories, and it seemed to listen to every word that she said. And even Angus, well, he stopped complaining quite so much. And she caught him just stroking its head when he thought she wasn't looking. And that seal, it started to become part of the family. But Angus, he looked with worry at Mary. After a week went by, and a couple of weeks went by, 3 weeks went by, and he said, "Look, Mary, love, you know the seal, it's not a pet. It's a wild animal. And it's not right for it to be in a house like this. It needs to go back to the sea." "I know," she said. I think the forecast is all right. I'll do it tomorrow." And the next morning, Angus said, Shall I come with you?" No, it's fine," she said. You go off fishing. We'll be just fine." And she said, "Well then, little one, I suppose we ought to be taking you down that path to the coast, eh?" And she set off walking to the coast, and there came the little seal, flip, 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 flip behind her. And the two of them, they walked down to the beach, and she said, "Well, there it is. There's the big bad sea that took you and rolled you, but you know, it's pretty calm today." And as she stood there talking, two heads bobbed up out in the water. And the little seal, it went flip, 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 sniffing the water until a little wavelet came up, and it paddled back, and then it started playing and chasing backwards and forwards with the waves, until then it took one big leap into the water with a splash, and it looked back at Mary and she said, "It's all right, you go on." Into the waters it went, splashing and swimming, and then its head bopped up and looked back at her, and she said, "It's fine. Go on now." And it swam out to those two other heads, and all those three heads together turned and looked at her, and then all three of them dived down below the waters. Well, the weather had been good, so there wasn't much on the high tide level, but she walked along the beach, just checking, and she walked back again. The seals didn't appear. And that night, when Angus came back, and he sat down on the other side of the fire from Mary, he didn't say a word about the seals eating his nets as he mended that day's holes. And the house had seemed quiet before the seal had come. And now it seemed so empty. And so it was an absolute blessing when a few weeks later, there came a knock at the door. And when Mary opened it, there was a young man there, and he was tall and handsome. He had dark hair and brown eyes. He was a good-looking young man. And he had an easel under his arm and a little bag over his shoulder. And he said, excuse me, I'm an artist. I'm a student. I'm at the university in Edinburgh, but I've come up because the light's so good here to paint over the summer. And I asked in the town, and they said that you might have a spare room that I'd be able to rent out for the summer and be able to work from while I paint. And she said, oh, yes, we've got room. You come away in. It'd be lovely to have your company. And she showed him in, and she showed him up to the little bedroom that they'd never really used for very much. But there was still a bed there, and it was just about big enough for him. And she made sure that she just spruced it up and gave it a little bit of a clean. And the young man's name was John. And well, Angus was delighted to meet him as well. And he shook him by the hand, and he sat there and he started telling him fishing stories. You know the sort of fishing stories. They all seem to be about the fish that was that big and the one that got away and all the things that had happened in the storms. And John, he listened and he laughed in all the right places. And the days went by, and Mary would busy herself in the day, and she would cook. Well, Angus was delighted because her cooking suddenly got an awful lot better, and there was always plenty of fresh bread when he came home at night, and there was a bit of male company to talk to in the evenings. And in the evenings, well, there was plenty of stories and laughter, and the three of them, well, they got on like a house on fire. And Angus said, you know, John, would you like to come out in the boat with me one of these times? Would you like to come and have a look at the fishing and how I do the nets and everything? And John said, well, I'd love to, but I've got to make the most of the light. I'm only here for a short time, and I just need to get as much work done as I can. But if there's a day where the light's not so good and it's a bit overcast and it's not so good for painting, I would love to come out on the boat with you. And so that's how it was left. And sure enough, when the weather changed and the light wasn't so bright and the clouds gathered in, one night Angus said, you know, I think it's going to be an all right day for fishing tomorrow. It's going to be overcast. The light's not going to be so good, but I don't think there's a storm coming in or rain. I think we'll have a good day's fishing if you want to come. And so it was agreed. Mary made up a picnic for the two of them. And John and Angus, they set off fishing the next day. But around the west coast of Scotland, the weather can change so quickly. The wind changes, the waves turn, and suddenly a clear sky can be almost black with thick rolling clouds. And so it was that day. Angus saw the signs. He saw the clouds beginning to boil, and he said, I think we'll maybe leave setting the last nets and we'll just head straight back for shore. And he'd been teaching John to row, but now he took hold of the oars and he put his back into it and he rowed as hard and as strong as he could, but he wasn't as fast as the waves coming towards him and the wind whipping them up into white tops. And soon the swell began and the boat began to lift and fall and lift and fall. And Angus was deeply regretting that today was the day that he had brought John out onto the waves. And he could see the shore now, but he didn't think he was going to make it in time. And he just couldn't control the swell. He couldn't keep the boat always guaranteed into the centre of the waves. They seemed to be coming from all directions. And then one enormous wave took the boat up into the air, tipped it over, and the boat capsized. John and Angus were both down into that deep, sharp, cold water, and Angus felt all of the breath being pushed out of his body and everything went dark. And then there was something with him in that darkness, something lifting him, something taking him to the surface, a huge gulp of air. He pulled it into his lungs. And he was pushed out of the surf, out of the waves. He could feel the shingle beneath his fingers. He pulled himself, crawling out onto the beach, looked around, and he realised that of all things, what had caught him, what had saved him, was a seal. Well, he tried to pull himself up, and he pulled himself up so he was crawling. And Mary, she was there with a shawl around her. She was running up and down the beach, and she saw him there, and she said, Angus, are you all right? Angus, are you all right? Where's John? Where's John? And Angus, he was still coughing up water. She could see that he was all right, but all he could do was just shake his head as she asked about John. And she went running up and down the shore. She was looking in the water. There's no sign of that young man. And the wind was still so strong. They were having to beat their way through the wind across the shore. And Angus, he was soaking wet and cold and shivering. She had to take him home. She came out again later, still searching the shore for John. But there was no sign of him. And as darkness began to fall, she had to go back to the croft where she had left Angus, sat huddled miserably underneath a blanket, a little dram and a glass to warm him through. And they couldn't even go to town to raise the alarm. The weather was so bad, they had to wait until the next day for it to calm, for Mary to be able to go into the town, to say what had happened, to talk about John, and to find out if anybody had heard any reports of a young man, if a young man had been found anywhere along the shore. Nobody had seen the young man, alive or dead. And they waited a few days to see if any news reports had come in. Nothing did. And so the policeman from the town, he came to Angus and Mary's little house. And Mary hadn't had the heart to go into John's room since he hadn't come back. But now the two of them, the policeman and Mary, they went in together. And that room, it was pristine. It looked like nobody had ever slept there. And there were no possessions there, no bag, nothing to say who John's people were or an address to send anything back to. All there was in that room was an easel. And on that easel was a canvas. And painted on that canvas was Mary herself. And she looked at it. There she was in every detail. And she was wearing that rubber apron. And in the rubber apron was the seal. She knew she had never told John about that seal. And she knew as she looked at that painting exactly who John was. And that John was going to be just fine. Thank you.
Oh, that's beautiful, Amy. Oh.
So that's the story of the Silky Painter. And I don't know how much people know about Selkies. There's a whole huge amount of Selkie folklore, and Selkies, well, the Silkies really, it's about because their fur is so silky and the feel of it. And they always have brown eyes. And if you see a seal, you can see the humanity in their eyes. They look so expressive. So they always have the brown eyes and dark hair. And that's always a bit of a clue that you might have a Silkie in your story. Just having a look to... It's all gone very, very under... Pardon, John?
Wasn't me.
No, I'm just asking, there's construction noise. Is it coming through here?
Just
I don't think it was
just a
construction,
little.
it was...
We wondered what it was, but don't
Okay.
worry. Don't worry. So let's go back to Duncan's. I mean, that's a good, gorgeous story. I think we just needed time to go. But
it's one of my favourites. I love that story.
Yeah. But I'd like to think a little bit of, it's that, he didn't just leap from his childhood to being the great performer. I mean, he had quite a hard life growing up, because that was through the Depression. He'd go into a transport cafe with me and he'd ask for a meat pie, no vegetables, because they were living off the roots that they got off the thing, and he was traveling with his first wife then in a bow top, wasn't it? I remember telling him that I'd been doing a project where I'd been at the Suffolk Show or something, and telling stories for the traveller liaison people, and so I was in front of a bow top, and there was a guy very well off. Gypsy man came by that ran a firm that imported huge agricultural machinery, but he was telling me that you could sell a bow top for £15,000. And I told Duncan that, and he said, well, I bought my first one for £5 and I sold it for 11, and I thought I'd made a fortune. And so how long was he actually in that first bit, because he came off the road, didn't he, before, and he went back on it with Linda, but there was a gap where he came off the road. So how long did he come off the road because of the death of his first wife, or?
I don't know if he came off it properly. I mean, it was he was still camping. He just wasn't traveling around so much. So he sort of settled in one place, but he was settled in a tent. He had a big galley tent, I think, and I think that's that was at Loch Gilphead where Linda met him and where Linda was starting to visit him. But yeah, I mean, he did have a tricky time. His first wife died of cancer, and at that point, it was kind of he had to split up the children because it wasn't the done thing, particularly when you're living in those close environs. And I think and men had a very definite role and women had a very definite role. And so he kept the sons with him, but he didn't feel able to look after the daughters and in the way that they should be looked after. And so they went to live with her sister, I think. I mean, they're still obviously kept in contact, and traveller families are very close and would be meeting up. And when they were on the site at Loch Gilphead, although the girls were in his sister's tent, they were all on the same site together, so they were still sort of seeing each other very, very regularly. But I mean, he had as many jobs as he could find, and I mean, he lived through that very interesting period where jobs were just changing all of the time, what you could do and how you could make a living. So I mean, he started off with very much the traditional crafts, and I don't know how much people know about traveller life. So let me get a couple of there's one of the things that I haven't got any of the baskets. I'm sure you've all seen sort of traditional willow baskets made, so that would be one of the ways. And Duncan was a great basket maker, but also sort of making flowers out of elder. And so you would have those. I mean, these are undyed, but you dye them with well, as Woolworth came in and did red dye, you could just buy dye from Woolworths. Otherwise you could make dye out of elderberries at the right season. And of course, they particularly you'd have them at Christmas because elder is soft in the centre, so you get privet or anything that was evergreen. So you could have a beautiful bunch of flowers at Christmas, which we don't think anything of now. We get flowers imported from all over the world. There's nothing special about having flowers in the winter. It's just we just take it for granted. But actually, to have beautiful flowers at Christmas and as part of your decoration, that would be quite a beautiful and quite a special thing. So they would make flowers, they would make baskets, they would make pegs. Duncan's father, like I said, was a tinsmith, but that all changed when aluminium and plastic came in, and all of a sudden people didn't want tinsmiths anymore. They didn't want to have their pots and pans mended by the tinkers, and they weren't buying toasting forks, kettles, pans, anything else, because they could just buy it really cheaply out of plastic. And so I think that's probably when Duncan started to get more into scrap. And of course he had a whole period of being the horsey man, and the period of travellers having horses was actually sort of quite brief in lots of ways. Duncan's family wasn't particularly a horsey family. His father didn't travel with a horse, but Duncan was obsessed with horses. Somebody was asking about, well, why did he get into stories? Yeah, he fell in love with stories, but actually he fell in love with horses first. Horses were his first love, and he spent a lot of time learning about horses, how to care for them, how to work with them, how to buy and sell them, and the whole thing about swapping horses and swapping up as you got through a season and then kind of swapping down as you needed the money. I mean, he said it took him 9 years to become a proper horsey man and to be respected by other travellers as a proper horsey man. And then of course that all stopped.
But he was still with his horses when he got his degree.
Yeah,
and that's the most phenomenal story, isn't it? That it's in the winter where he used to winter at a farm, and the really long, boring Scots winters, and he was sort of by a lamp, and so he did a postal degree in marine biology. And there's a wonderful story when he first came down to the Crick Crack Club for Ben Haggerty. They had the storytelling revival was just starting, and so there was headlines in the entertainment page of the Evening Standard or the Evening News saying illiterate Scots traveller leaves the Scotland for the first time, and he just chuckled. It was like, I've got a degree, man. There's Well,
it depends what mood you caught him in, and that was that thing that he would tell that story quite a lot about how important it was to his father that he learned to read, and he would make a big thing as I am not an illiterate traveller. I can read. I can write. I've got 14 books and a degree. It was like,
yeah. Well, he's very proud of it, and quite rightly so. I mean, like, it's no mean feat to get a degree by post in the while you're wintering.
But then he also sort of said, well, I already had all of that knowledge because he'd worked the coast and he knew so much about the tides and the fish and the shellfish and everything else that kind of he was learning the posh names and the received knowledge about it. But he said, well, he already knew most of that stuff anyway, and he was just adapting it and learning to put it into the right language.
So when did he start becoming getting? Because earning a living as an entertainer or being part of his living. At first, it was singing, wasn't it? Singing before storytelling. I mean, before people, bless their hearts, started paying us for telling stories. It was singing, wasn't he?
Well, yeah, because of course, there's a big folk revival in the 60s, wasn't there? So, and he became part of that. So he was singing with Billy, what's his face?
Billy Connolly. Humble Bums, early part of the Humble Bums, I think it was.
Yeah. Because that's what people wanted him to do. And and of course he had all of the songs. He had loads and loads of ballads, loads of songs. And there was also a story told me that there was one time he learned to sing in prison. There was one time when a policeman came and they was trying to move Duncan on, and I think his wife was pregnant, and they'd just set up camp. They were all completely exhausted, and the policeman started using some pretty ripe and pretty offensive language aimed at Duncan's wife, and Duncan would have took it if it was him. Aim at his wife. He just, and because he also, he said he was very adaptable and had lots of jobs. Another thing that he did was he was a prize boxer. He was a prize fighter, and he just like one hook knocked the policeman out, and got sent to jail for 30 days. So he was in the jail and he got put into a cell with a singing teacher, and he said, Duncan, your songs are great, but your breathing is terrible. And so he made him do breathing exercises every day for this 30 days and tried to teach him how to breathe to help him with his singing. And he said it was great. He learned loads, and he said his singing was much better. And he offered to buy the policeman a pint afterwards. Being the man that Duncan was. Yeah. Well,
I love the bit where he talks about running out of cigarette papers in prison. And so he rips a sheet, he tears a page out of the Bible to roll his cigarettes in, and he's hauled before the governor, and the governor starts going on to him, and Duncan said, I don't give a stuff about your religion. And the governor turned around to him and said, it's not the religion I'm worried about, it's the fact that you destroyed prison property. And but he was great. I took him into prison. Actually, if Maria Watton was here, we took him into young offenders as well, and he'd give away his instruments, wouldn't he? And he'd give away his mouth organ to some kid. It was great. But I took him into prison, and he was and I was a bit disappointed because there was only 4 or 5 guys came into the room to listen to him, and I thought, because if you've got a treasure, you want everyone to listen. Anyway, I kind of forgot about it, and 2 months later, from a totally different source, I heard one of Duncan's stories, and those 4 people had spread those stories around 400 men, and but let's go off the stories for a second. We were on the singing. Do you happen to have one of Duncan's songs? Because he used to sing to us all the time. I'm sure Ian Douglas was here a minute ago.
Well, this is the most embarrassing thing I've done, John, and I'm usually so paranoid about it. But this is the thing about homeschooling and sharing charging leads. Do you want to just tell a quick story about Duncan? I am going to leg it to the house and get my charger, otherwise I'm going to vanish. I am so sorry. And then I would love to tell you a song. I can't believe I've done that.
Be quick, because I
am going to run, literally run.
Well, Paul, you, I mean, you and I sort of probably spent more time with Duncan in a field in Norfolk.
Absolutely.
You would come up to the and that he'd bring it with Hugh Lupton.
Yeah, and that's as Amy was just saying, one of the magical things about Duncan was he gave so much. Always gave. And one of the things, I think the first time I ever met him, there was a thunderstorm over Aylsham, and the sky was getting blacker and blacker. And he said, I think I've got just about enough time to teach you how to play the mouth harp. So he taught me how to play the mouth harp, and ever since, every time I ever play it, I think of Duncan. So I always have about 10 in my pocket when I go to schools. I talk about Duncan, and I always give a mouth harp to somebody in the school, with the one promise that, like Duncan, that you share it like a story. So yeah, Duncan's always traveling with me via what Amy's got in her mouth right now, a mouth harp.
I am so sorry about that. One of the children nicked me charger and I just hadn't realised. And I'm sorry that I missed Paul's story because that sounded great. Right. So you wanted a song?
Well, yeah, because I mean, especially when when I was rolling around the country with him, in my old Bedford CF, would tell stories and sing songs and his poems. I mean, he was a great poet as well, and
absolutely.
But and he kind of sang, from everything from the Widow's Moor to to country and western stuff.
I taught him that.
It was just, yeah, I know.
I'm not sure the world has ever forgiven me for teaching the Widow's Moor.
Yeah, but and again in prison, he did, I kind of took him into the sort of Wednesday evening sort of lay Christian thing, because I'd have to do stuff at the chapel, because that I rented the chapel because it had the best acoustics by doing sessions in their sessions, and I took story, and he sang. I thought I was going to get a real traditional number, and he burst into some country and western song. It kind of didn't. You never knew what you were going to get, and I have no idea what I'm going to get from you, Amy.
Well, I was just putting on the chat to see if anybody had any preferences. What do you want, everybody? Would you like Lady Margaret or The Unquiet Grave or Yarrow?
Right.
Dun, 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 dun. So
somebody knows a bit.
Right. We've got...
You got a request?
We've got one vote for Yarrow and one vote for Lady Margaret.
Right. Well, do both. We ain't gone on.
Okay. Lady Margaret sits in a high chamber, aside the silken seam, and she look at east and she look at west, to where the leaves grow green, to where the leaves grow green, while she's picked up her petticoats beneath a holland gown. She's run down to the merry greenwood, and it's there she's let them down, It's there she's let them down. Well, she had not plucked one nut, or scarcely three, when the highest lord in all the countryside came riding through the trees, came riding through the trees. How dare you pick those nuts, those nuts? How dare you bend my tree? How dare you come to the merry green wood without any leave of me, without any leave of me? Well, sir, once in time these woods were mine, without any leave of thee, and I can pick these nuts, and I can bend these trees, I can bend these trees. Well, he's taken her gently by the hand, he's gently laid her down, and when he'd had his will of her, he rose her up again, he rose her up again. Now you've had your will of me, come tell to me your name, and if a baby I should have, I will call it the same, I will call it the same. And he said, well, my name is William, and once all of these woods were mine. When I was a child, I came to these woods and I saw the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. And she was riding through the forest, surrounded by gentlemen and ladies, and she was dressed all in green, and such a vision I had never seen. And she came to me. She smiled, and I was lost. She held out a hand and she pulled me onto the horse behind her, and away we rode. And from that time on, sometimes it seems but a day, sometimes it seems an eternity, and that my life before was only a dream. But Margaret, if you are who you say you are, that means that you were betrothed to me when we were both but children, and now you are the one person who can set me free. Will you set me free? If you come tonight, down to the 5-bar gate. First there will come some dark horses, and then there'll come some brown horses. I will be on the milk-white horse. If you can be brave, if you can pull me down, if you can wrap your arms around me and not let me go, then we can be together forever, Margaret. But the Fairy Queen, she will try everything she can do to make you let go. But will you try? Margaret, she listened, and she nodded her head. So that night at the midnight hour, Lady Margaret made her way, and when she came to the 5-mile gate, she waited patiently, she waited patiently. First there came some dark, and then there came some brown, but then there came a milk-white steed, and she pulled the rider down, oh down, she pulled the rider down. First he turned to a wicked snake, and then to a lion so wild, but she held him fast and she held him tight. He may be the father of her child, the father of her child. Then he turned to a naked man, and an angry man was he, but she threw her mantle over him, and then she had him free, then she had him free. Then came the voice of the Fairy Queen, and an angry queen was she. If I had have known yesterday, oh, what I know today, I'd have taken out your very heart's blood and put in a heart of clay, put in a heart of clay. Lady Margaret on the milk-white steed, Lord William on a dapple grey, with a bugle and a horn hanging down by his side. It's merrily they rode away, away, it's merrily they rode away. Oh merrily, oh merrily, oh merrily, oh merrily, it's merrily they rode away, away. Oh merrily, oh merrily, oh merrily, oh merrily, It's merrily they rode away.
Oh wow!
That's the Lady Margaret version.
Whoa!
Lady Margaret.
Well, one of our guests has got to go. I need to say hello to him and goodbye, Michael. It's been great to see you here. It's a shame we haven't got anyone who was taught the harmonica by Duncan, because you don't play the harmonica, do you, Amy?
Me, very badly. I mean, because I can't double tongue it.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a virtuoso. He was
Yeah,
amazing.
it was great. I mean, it's a shame that Michael never met him, because Michael is, what is it, president of the American Harmonica Society or something?
Yes, Society for the Preservation and Advancement of the Harmonica.
Oh,
And
wow.
he spoke to me about the mouth harp. I was like, yeah, but I loved it. Was fabulous. I'm sitting here in the middle of nowhere in Texas, and it was just lovely to hear some bits of Britain. Thank you so much, Amy.
Oh, well, it's great to meet you, and I'm sure that there'll be some recordings of him playing the mouth harp. I haven't actually got any that I've found yet. I've got him of the Jew's harp, but not the mouth harp, not the harmonica. Yeah. But he double tongued it and was great. I can scrape out a tune, but I'm not a. Wasn't.
The other people that are on here are Charlie and Liz Monk, who are very old friends. I've known Charlie since the '60s, and they're in Bishop's Castle, live near you, I think. So we visit them when we come over. So we'll hopefully meet you in person next.
Oh, fantastic! Well, Bishop's Castle, then they will be within about 5 minutes walking distance, because it's not a very big place.
Yes, the 3 tons will be there. Yeah.
Fantastic! I am well up for that.
Yeah.
And shout out to the 3 tons. They are doing home delivery at the moment, so so yes, I'm still having the odd pint from there, but not sadly in the pub.
Yeah.
Well, that's another. The thing with these sessions is there's a great many post-lockdown get-togethers being planned. Shane, I know you've got something coming up later in the week, but Amy, have you got any questions for her?
Bye, John. Thank you so much. Bye, Amy.
Bye,
Michael. Lovely to have your company.
Yeah, I'm really enjoyed it.
I'm going to hold back on the questions.
In tears, Amy.
Pardon? What did you say, Michael?
I'm going to hold back on any questions for Saturday.
Okay. Right.
Just a comment though is just to see Amy singing, and that passion in the singing is. I'm very moved by that. That real, really inhabiting that character for that moment was just very powerful for me.
Yeah, it's true. It is truly It's been truly moving the whole evening so far. Now. Just
a comment on the song, because you were talking about stories and songs all the time, and I mean Duncan just saw them as completely interchangeable, and definitely he would, because that is quite a contentious song in lots of ways. He would never sing it without wanting to give some of the background of it in this whole way that kind of Margaret is a spinster, she's sort of been left on the shelf, even though she's highborn. She's an old one because everybody's been betrothed when they're children. There's nobody left for her. And so although there is that moment where you're not sure if it's a rape or if it's consensual or not, it's part of that contract, and it's sort of a fulfillment of a contract from birth, and it's within that time, and it's very much within the whole piece. And he was really passionate that people would know about that, because he got quite upset when there was the big debates about Tamlin and it being a terrible song and stuff. So, and obviously that's his version of the equivalent of Tamlin. So that was just my little tuppenny worth there.
Well, it's the tuppenny worth that Monday nights are about. Yeah. So how does everyone feel? I mean, because we've only got. Well, I thought maybe we'd get to 3,000 stories, 500 songs, or something tonight. But are you all happy? Are we all sitting comfortably? Yeah. Just wave. Just put your thumbs up.
I do want to say goodbye to Rika. Rika, when you've got to do things with your cat, you've got to do things with your cattle. But it's been lovely to have your company. Has she already gone?
Yeah, but possibly, yeah. But so Amy, could you please do us one last story before we go? and then have anyone anyone, and then anyone ask questions or just comments or just tell you how wonderful you are or anything. There's well, one last story would be fantastic if no one's going home.
With pleasure. How long do you want? Because the only thing, I mean, Duncan hasn't got that many very short stories. I try and keep it shortish, but
Yeah,
they
well,
do tend to go on.
Bianca, are you okay? You know, we kind of rely on Bianca a little bit and Mike. So if Bianca and Mike are okay, just
Well, it's up to you. You tell me how long a story you would like.
well,
Do you have a favourite, Amy? Have you got a favourite Duncan story?
I've got several.
Well, which one speaks to you at the moment?
Well, I always love The Hunchback and the Swan, but that's very well known. I mean, if you need a short one, I could tell you The Holy Horse, which is a bit of a joke, really. But maybe.
Oh, I love the Holy. Oh, please do the Holy Horse.
Want the Holy Horse?
Yeah, I love that Holy Horse.
Okay, well, that is quite a nice
one.
short one.
It's one that I've adapted for a child in the thing, and it's just it's such a great story, and I've forgotten a lot of the lead up. So please, just for me.
Well, there was once a minister on the Isle of Lewis, and he was always complaining that he never had enough money and how little money a minister earned, even though he always seemed to earn quite enough to line his backside quite well. He was not a thin man, but he needed a horse, and he had to have a pony, because obviously he would have the sermons on a Sunday in church, and he would encourage everybody from the whole of the island to come to the sermons, but there would always be a few people who were ill or just couldn't travel so far, so the rest of the week he would be having to go around the island and checking on that everybody was okay and making sure that, you know, everybody was sorted and had the word of the Lord in their ear that particular week. And his old pony was getting so slow that he couldn't make it to the other side of the island and back within a day anymore. And he was going to have to finally spend some money and buy a new horse. And so he went to Lachlan, the horse dealer, and Lachlan saw him coming. And he was out in the yard with a big broad smile on his face, and he said, Minister, welcome. I've been hoping that you would come. I was thinking that you would be coming a little bit sooner than you have, really, as he looked at the old decrepit pony that was limping in with the minister. He said, I have the perfect horse for you. She's a holy horse. Oh, don't be ridiculous, said the minister. There's no such thing as a holy horse. Animals don't have spirits. Oh, this horse, not only is she the most beautiful beast I've ever had in these stables, not only can she fly like the wind, she is a holy horse. Well, she sounds a bit as if she's going to be too expensive for me, said the minister. Just see her, said Lachlan. Off Lachlan went. Moments later, he brought back the horse, already saddled, already bridled. And she was about 15-2, beautiful white mare, gorgeous, nice-natured, led her up to the minister and said, now you just climb on and see how she fits you. And so the minister put his foot in the stirrup and he hauled himself up onto the back of the pony, the back of the mare, and well, she wasn't quite as broad as his old pony, but she was comfortable, and she had a little lightness about her. She was just prancing and dancing just enough to have a little bit of life. And he said, come on then, come on. She didn't move. Come on, gee up. Wouldn't move. He dug his heels in. She wasn't going to move. I told you, said Lachlan. She's a holy horse. You have to say the right words, else she'll not move a muscle. And what are the words, said the minister. You just pat her neck, said Lachlan, and say, bless you. And so that's what the minister did. He patted her neck. Bless you, he said. And she started to walk. A lovely, lively walk. And it said, oh, can I take her out? Can I take her out on the moors? Can we have a try? Of course you can, said Lachlan, but you will need to know how to stop. So when you want to stop, you just need to say, Amen. Bless you to go. Amen to stop. No problem, said the minister. Bless you, he said, and he started trotting out of the yard. And once they were out onto the yard, bless you, and now he was cantering up the road and then up onto the top, onto the moors, bless you, because now the heather had opened out, he had free rein, and he was galloping that mare, bless you. She was flat out, she was flying like the wind was blowing in what was left of the minister's hair. He hadn't been this fast for years and years and years, and he shouted with the joy of being out and the speed. But there, coming rapidly towards him, he could see the sea, he could see the edge of the island, and he realised that soon he would be running out of heather and moor, and they would be coming to the cliff edge. And he couldn't remember how to stop. And he was racing through, and he couldn't remember. And he did the only thing that a minister could do in that situation. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation. Yours is the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. And just on the edge of the cliff, her front hooves teetering half on, half off, the minister clinging on to her mane to stop the momentum pulling him off the edge of the cliff. She stopped. Oh, bless you, said the minister. We needed a little bit of silliness, I think.
I love that. I love it. That, of course, is the same minister that used to have his whiskey delivered and labelled Bibles, wasn't it? And the ferryman said, "Minister, your Bibles are
Your
leaking."
holy books are leaking. Yeah.
Oh, has anyone got any cut? Paul, have you got anyone you want to throw in, or anyone got questions?
I did put up earlier, Amy.
Yeah, I was just going to.
It was just about Linda and you working with Linda on this project. And are you?
I mean, the thing about the tapes is that obviously I needed to get them digitized to save them, but I didn't know what was on them. I mean, that was the thing. It was quite a terrifying thing to do, because I raised the money and I kind of and there was also a bit of a thing about kind of where they were going to be digitized. We got and having talked with Linda and with her family and her children, we did get them digitised at the School of Scottish Studies at the archive there. And I was terrified that I would have left it too late and that they were all going to be blank or just unplayable, or but when we finally took them into the archives, I mean, they are all tapes that Linda recorded pretty much. Some of them, I mean, turned out to be copies of things that are already at the archives that Linda had copied and taken home to work on her PhD. So some of them were recorded by other people like Barbara McDermott and Alan Bruford. So and that was a whole thing that I hadn't really thought of beforehand, where sort of copyright does become a bit of an issue. So I mean, I can't share things that were recorded by people other than Linda, because I don't have the permission from Barbara McDermott and Alan Bruford. I have sort of contacted them and wanted to be in touch with them. But I've been talking to Linda all the way through, because this is their family's legacy, and I am truly blessed, and I feel so honoured about how they've welcomed me into their family. And I think Linda's really appreciated having the support and feeling that she doesn't have to do it all on her own, and it's kind of given her a new impetus to do a bit more as well. So I thoroughly recommend all of you friending Linda on Facebook. I've been working on a crowdfunding album, so the people who put in some money to help me digitise the tapes and to have some match funding for the Arts Council bid. One of the things that I said I would do was put some material together for them. So it's all the material sorted. I'm just finishing off editing it, and then I've got to do the scary bit, which is working out how to sort out download codes and get it hosted online. But a lot of the stuff that's on there, Linda's been putting out on Facebook as stories with pictures, so she's been sending lots of Duncan stories out on there, and so we've been backwards and forwards all the time, and and talking through her to her children as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Amy, I had a question earlier about Duncan learned his stories orally. Books were not a transmission, but I'm just wondering, what is the if you know the status of how stories are being passed on in the Traveller folk at the present day?
Well, they are, but not as much, I don't think. I mean, they still will be part of evenings within traveller culture, as John was saying. I mean, there'll be a lot of country music being sung as well, and that people will just bring whatever, and they will tell the old stories, and they'll tell them to the children. They'll be done as children's stories as well. I don't know anybody that is like Duncan, and also that generation. There was a generation of fantastic traveller storytellers and singers. So there was Sheila Stewart as well as Duncan. There was Stanley Robertson. I was talking to Bob Pegg and Mario MacArthur, and they spent a lot of time with Alec Williamson, different family, and all of those, that last generation, they're all dead now, but they were the last generation who really remembered what it was like to travel, because obviously the traveling life has been decimated. All the camping grounds were closed down. It's been made very difficult for people to travel. A lot of travellers are put on sites, and their way of life has really been decimated. And with that comes a lot of radio and television. So it is within the culture, but that generation really experienced kind of the life of the stories.
And some people, I think, sorry.
I think just want to get over. I mean, that generation were incredibly generous, and they made a decision to step out of just traveller culture and to share that with the wider world, and to let people in and to let people know a little bit more about travellers, which can be quite a closed society. So there may be other travellers that are telling, but they've stayed within the culture and they're not really stepping out.
But I mean, I think, this happens at different times, doesn't it? It happened at the end of the 19th century. So you have people like John Roberts in Wales who collected stuff and was prepared to share it with Dorothy Yates and the Suffolk vicar that travelled around and wrote in gypsy tents. And now now you've got new traveller archivists like Richard O'Neill, who I'm hoping he'll join us in 2 weeks' time. But we're getting a lot of people from the traveller community around Wales and England, and also Roma from Romania. In 2 weeks' time, we're doing a whole program. It's the same Monday night program, but it will be contemporary. It'll be kind of interesting. It's taking a lot of digging. I'm making a lot of phone calls right now, but I think we're going to have it together. So on the 29th, you might. I have no any more than Amy. I have no idea of the answer to that question, but I'm hoping we'll get some people from the community that might give us the answer. That'd be great, wouldn't it?
I have been asking and digging, and I, the prejudice keeps coming and going as well, and I mean, the travellers have been having a really hard time, and I don't know what other people's experience has been, but it seems in lots of ways, and it's great having the whole Black Lives Matter thing going on at the moment, and absolutely, I think that is really crucial, and we need to change the way that our society is structured. But in my personal experience, and I'm hating the stories that are coming out from Black people and the stories of prejudice that they faced, in my own circle, I don't know anybody who would feel that it was okay to use racist language towards somebody that was Black. And yet people that I would normally consider to be quite liberal and left-wing would go, oh, God, yeah, no, I look a mess. I look like a right dirty jippo. And I've heard people go that, and you just, like, your mouth drops open. You go, why do you think that would be acceptable to say something like that? And people still use tinker and jippo as derogatory language, and it is still very much within our society, and I am not surprised that they're closing down a little bit. And I think, all of us are having a hard time.
And also, some of the traditional ways where people did, where the two things came together. I mean, my wife, when she was alive, came from a little village outside near Stapler. It wasn't even a village; it was a hamlet. And part of the rhythm of the year was the gypsies passing through and the horse drawn, and the women selling clothes pegs, and Rosie's mum would always bring them in for a cup of tea. So it would, part which, and that sort of being part of the rhythm of the year in rural areas, I think.
Yeah, and it's exactly the same here. I mean, like where I live in Bishop's Castle, and sort of what you were talking about, John Roberts. I mean, they think they've got connections really to the Locks, but the Lock family was the gypsy family here that kind of we would be part of their annual route and their annual circle, and people knew them and they knew them by name, and they would come and they would swap stories. There'd be quite a lot of beer when they came round, and people would swap the tunes and the songs and the stories, and they'd turn up at their campfire with a beer, and people knew them. And with camping grounds being shut down, and with those regular circles and that rhythm of life being stopped, there's a lot more distance that have become between the settled folk and the traveller folk.
But I suppose the one art form that is still existing well in East Anglia is step dancing, because there's the East Anglian step dance and gypsy step dance is crossing over, and the same people arrive. So so there's pubs that will do that, and the families come together for those. Settled and gypsy families come together for that, for that particular art form, and it's an art form that's been passed down.
I think piping would probably be equivalent in Scotland.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
But storytelling and ballad singing is a different thing. They are known and they are around, but there's not the people taking on the mantle in quite the same way, because it wasn't everybody. I mean, there would always be specific people who were in charge of that sort of thing. You have somebody in a family. It wouldn't be like everybody who would automatically take to that, and those people don't seem to be.
I mean, I suppose the looking at it optimistically, like in any and I've noticed this in other cultures, that what happens when as education improves and so forth, and a middle class arise, the middle class from that culture realizes what they've lost, and there's this great interest in what's lost. So I mean, it won't be the same, but it'll be a revival, through the families. I mean, that's my optimistic view.
Yeah, and what I will say is Jimmy Williamson is a fantastic songwriter, and Duncan was a songwriter as well. So Jimmy's a great singer and a guitar player and a songwriter, and he does the old ballads as well. He does tell some stories. He doesn't tell as many stories, and and I'd love to get him down to England more. And he's certainly got the talent. He's just not he's not been doing as much, but he certainly knows all the stories. And I think all of Duncan's children, they know the stories, and they'll pass them on within their families. Definitely.
Yeah.
And Betsy, she won.
Probably we'll hear them from Tommy's children or something rather than from Tommy himself. And because they'll be proud, my granddad was the great Duncan Williamson. It's a thing, isn't it?
So his children also feel like that, to be fair, but they just wanted to find their own path.
Well, absolutely. No, but that's, if you're one generation removed, you're not having to be, and you're right, in a fantastic singer. I saw him at Duncan's 10th anniversary of his death up at the Scottish Storytelling Centre. Brilliant song.
Yeah, I've just seen Mike Ruster's just appeared at the bottom of my screen somewhere, and I think Mike Ruster's hoping to get Jimmy for Get Words and Edgeways Festival next year, so hopefully he's going to be coming down for that. Is that right? I'm putting you on the spot here, Mike.
Yes, I don't know if you can hear me, but that is on a list of things we're thinking of doing. Yes. So,
right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry to come in late. I thought you started at 7 o'clock. I'm only human.
Well, you can watch it doesn't go away. So anyone who's had to leave early or anyone says, "Oh, I wish I'd seen that," you know, although they won't be able to join in the conversation, they can see what the conversation was, and they can listen to Amy's great telling, and you know, and us rattling on about Duncan and beautiful songs. So so you haven't missed it, Mike. You sort of just come in for a bit of conversation at the end,
Right.
and you can watch the rest at your leisure.
Sure.
So, well, Amy, it has been fantastic. You know, I've just got. I'm sorry. This is kind of what has to be done at the end. I have to sort of announce what's coming up. You know, like you would, like if I was at a folk club. You know, and emceeing at a folk club. You know.
Marriage notices.
Yeah. So we're giving people another chance to. You can see all these things, but anyway, but we're giving people another chance. We're highlighting sets in the past, and so tomorrow morning we've got Amanda Edmondson's set, Edmiston set, and that's she's talking about her travels in Morocco, and it's a woman adventurer. I mean, she is an adventurer. And then Mike Dodsworth from Chelmsford live in the evening. No, I'm totally on the wrong week, of course. Right. Okay, Mike, I never did that. To ignore the last 2 minutes, put your fingers in your ears. Right.
We love you just as you are, John. No need to apologize.
Alexander Digger is a poet. Is another chance to hear his set, and then we've got Maria Credelli, who's live in the evening. And then Wednesday, this is the reason I knew I was on the wrong week, because I'm really looking forward to this. At 2 o'clock, we're doing the live thing at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which for some people might be difficult, but on the other hand, but because she lives in India, it means I don't have to wake her up in the middle of the night. We've got Jeeva's on at Raghunath. I'm trying to read my own writing here. And then we're repeating, and I know Mike doesn't use the word, but in this case, I think it's a valid use of the word. Kath Little did a fantastic set earlier at 2 o'clock at the weekend. But I really want to get, you know, because it was so good, I want to give people another chance to hear it and make sure they hear it on the same week. So Kath Little's fantastic set. I recommend that. Goes out at 6 o'clock again on Wednesday. We again another chance to hear Vero Chambers on Thursday in Morocco, and then Dave Driver, Kim Wankamp on Friday at 2, and then David Driver live. And so it goes on. Justin Demir, another chance. Giles in the evening on Saturday, and Kirsty it's really difficult with one lens, all this stuff. On another chance on Sunday, but and for the first time, Gilly Southwood from South Africa on Sunday evening. So, but you needn't actually remember what I've said, because I can never remember what I've said. You can look on the site, and you will see what is happening. And it's also spelt properly on the site, and those with complete eyesight will be able to read it. But for now, can we all give Amy Douglas one fantastic round of applause, because it has been a real pleasure.
Well, and thank you, John, for all of your memories and your fabulous hosting, and thank you.
Thank you.
And am I allowed to do a couple of parish notices too? Slip a few in, is that all right?
Please do.
So just so as part of my my bid, it is sort of it's having time to sort of think and talk about Duncan and where we are within the tradition. And I've started on Tuesday evenings at 8 o'clock. I do Taking the Tradition On, which is talking to usually a storyteller at 8 o'clock, not always. And tomorrow Mike Rust is on just down there. So I'm going to be talking to Mike Rust, who has just been incredibly influential in the resurgence of storytelling in England, and is one of the few, I think, genuine collectors of the oral tradition of the generation down from Duncan, of the, of the younger generation. It's not often you get called younger generation, is it, Mike? And I'm really looking forward to some of those stories about collecting from foresters and while you're working on the land, but also the beginning of the Society of Storytelling, the beginning of Festival of the Edge, the beginning of Tales at the Edge, which was the first story round in England, really. And it's if it hadn't been for Mike Rust, I would never have met Duncan Williamson, and there wouldn't have been a storytelling club for me to go to, and I would probably be a colour chemist in a lab somewhere. So thank you very much, Mike, and we're going to be talking about that.
And before you go to the next one, while we've got Mike there, if if you want to actually engage with this particular site, we'd be honoured to have you do something. Whether it's complete talk or whether you want to come in on one of the Monday night sessions talking about resurgence and so forth, but just get in touch with us. World Story.
Yeah, it's very nice of you to invite me, John. And as I step back into this world at a bit more of a higher profile, I'd love to come and join in with you. You are a name that's well regarded, and people speak about you to me a lot. So
thank you very much.
And there's another fellow who I've never met. If we're just chatting and haven't had a beer, he's called Shane Ibbs. Hello, Shane. We've never met. So, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yes.
I'm looking forward to meeting you. So.
And you too. And I can vouch for John.
Oh, can you?
Yeah. You get your $5 later.
A $5? Don't start paying them too much, mate.
Oh God! I want money, won't I?
No. Yeah, they get nectar points. Now, come on.
So, Amy, I cut into your parish notices there.
I'm sorry, I will try and be quite brief. Well, the other one is just to say that I'm going to be with Shane, as you mentioned, on Saturday at the Wonderland Festival. So Shane, I don't know how I've still got to work out how to get into that. How do people find that out?
Good question. It's just been put up on the Into the Wild Facebook page, and there should be a intothewild.com or .org.com. I'm not very good at this sort of stuff. Certainly on Facebook, Into the Wild. Go into their summer festival, and there's something on there. Actually, I've also put it up on Society for Storytelling as well on their Facebook.
Right. So that's going to be environmental
fantastic.
Stories.
I mean, I think that's important that in this time of lockdown that we all support each other. There's because we're all it's like we could be like a lot of pubs, saying, oh well, you mustn't mention that and that the other. But I think in this kind, if we're mutually supportive, we can build and build and build. Amy, have you done your parish notices?
I have, and Justine put it up, so thank you, Justine.
You're welcome. I'm telling at 4, and there's some other storytellers at 10:30 as well, so it's a day.
So yeah, this Saturday, Into the Wild is going to be a great place to be.
Yeah, except not at 6 o'clock when we've got
6.
Giles. Right. No, Into the Wild isn't happening at 6 o'clock. And whatever they put up on their Facebook page, it's a lie. The amazing Giles Abbott with this fantastic stuff.
We fit in between the World Storytelling Cafe. Don't worry.
We fit
That's
in.
okay.
We're
Right.
in between.
Don't worry.
Bless you all.
A bit
Fantastic.
of thought went into it, John.
I'm sure you have. No, I trust you all implicitly. Right. Okay, yeah, the storytelling fights, street fighting. No, brilliant. It's been a brilliant night. It's been a wonderful night. And so thank you all. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Amy.
Thanks for doing it. Thanks, Amy.
Storytelling Cafe. I mean, because this has just been an amazing thing that has come together over lockdown. It's just, the World Storytelling Cafe is just a bit of a phenomenon. It's amazing. So well done to you, John, and well done to all of the team.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, and Mike's in the background, but it's kind of
Course
that's
I
that it came from Mike. I'm just the front man. So,
Well, we really are a world project. We've got quite a few people on from Africa tonight, from Morocco. Romanian team are definitely here as well, and yeah, no, it's great. We're having fun.
Well, it is, and it's just a fantastic opportunity to hear people that I would never normally get to hear. So it's really good. Thank you.
That's lovely to hear. Thank you, and thanks again for tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
this is one of those long goodbyes when we're at the door.
Yeah,
Isn't it?
should we all go to the
back,
pub
you
now?
know, like,
Good night. Thank
oh,
you.
just
Off to bed.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh, bye.
good night. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Safe journey to everyone.
Yes.
Thank you.
And Norman, get Harriet to get in touch with us as well.
I'll get back to you on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic.
Bye-bye.